Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies Distinguished Public Lecture. We are pleased to have Dr. Marty Natalegawa as our speaker for today. Dr. Marty is our distinguished visiting fellow and previously served as the Foreign Minister of Indonesia from the year 2009 to 2014. He is a longtime friend of RSIS, and we appreciate him taking time away from his busy schedule from time to time to share with us his thoughts and whatever issues he deemed it necessary to propagate and share with us. Today, he is going to talk to us about promoting amity, diplomacy and dialogue as statecrafts in a fragmented world. I don't think I will say anything new if I mention that the world today is going through a deepening fragmentation in the international order. The geopolitical competition between the major powers have inevitably fueled regional and global disputes. Where dispute exists now, I think, is further aggravated to all level of despair. Today, let us look at these dialogues from the perspective of Dr. Marty. We have all kinds of challenges facing the international community. Climate change is often repeated everywhere. At the same time, we also have the challenges in cyberspace. Fragmentation leaves a delicate environment difficult for multilateralism to prosper. These conditions engender protectionism and fuel misperception. Not surprisingly, many states, many countries, including Singapore, believes that diplomacy and dialogue will help manage fragmentation and find shared solutions. Marty's years of experience as a diplomat for Indonesia, first as the country's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Ireland, and the United Nations, and finally as foreign minister, has earned him the trust of his peers, making him one of the most respected foreign policy thinkers in Indonesia and Southeast Asia today. Dr. Marty was one of the strongest proponents for the creation of the ASEAN community and served as president of the UN Security Council in November 2007. He also served as a distinguished fellow or an advisor in various institutes and forums relevant for our discussion today. These include being part of the Center for Strategic and International Study in Washington, D.C., and the Jeju Forum in the Republic of Korea. Without further ado, let us hear what Dr. Marty Natalegawa has to say today, and maybe he can find the solution to all our problems confronting the international community, or at least in Southeast Asia and inside the ASEAN circles. Dr. Marty, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Paung Keng Yong, for such a generous and kind introduction. I'd like to thank all colleagues who are here this afternoon for your interest, and I am anticipating your incredible patience in listening to what I'm about to share, my thoughts on diplomacy and dialogue as statecrafts in a fragmented world. Paung Keng Yong has already described in brief and yet in a comprehensive manner at the same time the state of our world today, the multiple evidence of fragmentation and division that is common. At the risk of oversimplification, there are certainly a number of dynamics that we have to be mindful of as we look at the world around us. Certainly one overriding almost dynamic is one of the deepening geopolitical divides facing us today. And such a divide, such a geopolitical divide, is not only exclusive to the well-known one, namely, for instance, the China-US geopolitical competition, but also as well a number of other geopoliticals surrounding our Southeast Asia. For instance, the dynamic between China and India, I think, is something that is not to be overlooked. The uncertainties in Northeast Asia that is we are witnessing. We see, for instance, in Northeast Asia, not only the well-known unknown, so to speak, of the Korean Peninsula dynamic, we have also at the same time currently witnessing the evolution of potentially new architectures in Northeast Asia. On the one hand, the trilateral that the United States, Korea, and Japan is developing, and on the other hand, the pre-existing trilateral between China, Korea, and Japan. Further down to the south, we see uncertain conditions in East China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, South China Sea. In short, ours is an age of ever-deepening geopolitical divide, and I think it's best for us to try to understand the drivers behind such tendency. Is it one driven essentially by trust deficit, or is it essentially one of inability to deal or to manage change? Some of us are quite keen to emphasize that we are entering a new type of order, whether it be from unipolar to bipolar to multipolar, or perhaps ours is an age when change is ever permanent, that perhaps it may not be quite correct to assume that we are moving from one order to the next, but simply the reality is one of permanent change, permanent disorder, so to speak. Certainly, if one was to identify evidence of a fragmented world, the deepening geopolitical divide must rank as one of the main manifestations of that phenomenon. Besides such deepening geopolitical divide, we are witnessing the widening of geopolitical competition, such that nowadays the geopolitical competition that we are describing is taking place not only in the political security domain, but increasingly to other global commons issues as well. Some of the most important issues that requires cooperation between nations, that defies national solutions, issues such as climate, global health issues, the management of the global economy, its trade, finance, global supply chains, all of them have not been immune from the impact of geopolitical competition. A lot of these spaces have become weaponized, shaped and molded by political, geopolitical motivations and dynamics. Not only geopolitical divide that's deepening and widening, I must also mention a different type of divide, that between global north and global south. Some of us are of sufficient vintage to recall in the 70s, talks of North-South divide, new international economic order, which was quite in vogue and current at the time. But nowadays, the so-called global South and global North divide is seemingly returning before us. A sense of injustice, perhaps, definitely a yearning for change on the part of many in the global South in the face of a global governance system which they feel to be no longer fit for purpose, no longer reflective of the current situation as we have it. And not least of all, and I think this is arguably the easiest manifestation of our fragmented world, would be the prevalence of conflicts all around us. From Gaza, obviously, Ukraine, much of parts of Africa, bilateral as well as internal in nature. In short, and I'm sure each and every one of you would be far more able than I to describe or to identify other manifestation of this fragmented world. What is unique, however, in my view, is that not only are we facing such a fragmented world, we are concurrently facing headwinds against diplomacy, headwinds against dialogue, precisely when they are needed most. This makes our world especially fraught with danger, because often case, whenever crises occur, for instance, between two countries, bilateral crisis, often the first casualty of such a situation is the ending of diplomatic ties, such to demonstrate or to signal protest. When diplomacy is needed most, often case, the first casualty is to actually shut down diplomatic communication and dialogue. We are seeing as well multilateralism in retreat. When we witness situations on the issue of developments in the Middle East and many parts of the world, we see the United Nations system almost facing quite serious challenges and difficulties. A Security Council unable to take collective decision because of the exercise of veto, for instance. There may be multilateral institutions, but multilateralism as an outlook, as a perspective, is one that is in short supply today. Because the threat or the headwinds against multilateral approach is not only traditional in the sense of interstate, but also national as well. Increasingly, countries adopt a very domesticated foreign policy, looking at multilateral institutions as a threat to their sovereign rights. Countries speak eloquently about the need to support multilateralism, but one of the first inert or inclination of countries is to avoid their issues from becoming multilateralized or internationalized. So the threat against multilateralism is not only institutional defects, but also the challenge originating from the perspectives or the mindset. And not least of all, headwinds against diplomacy when we look at regional architectures, including here in the Indo-Pacific. Regional architectures, regional processes used to be able to take up the gaps and to deal with the inefficiencies of global multilateral organizations, but increasingly as a manifestation of that geopolitical division that I mentioned, increasingly the regional architectures are also facing strains, and regional architectures beginning to reflect divisions rather than inclusions. And here I think in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, we are seeing increasingly an ASEAN, for instance, that is being circumvented by other processes that are less inclusive in nature. I did say the depiction that I described just now risks oversimplification, because in the time allotted to me, it would be impossible to deep dive and to really reflect on some of those elements that I mentioned. But I hope you would agree with me or share some of my thoughts that indeed we are facing a world that is increasingly fragmented, divided, and as well a world, notwithstanding the need for such an approach, a world that is increasingly moving away from pursuing diplomacy and dialogue as ways and means, as instruments to manage these challenges. It was in fact such a recognition, Pak Ong Keng Yong, that brought some of us, individuals like myself, and here we have Dr. Nolin Heiser as well, to come together the past 6 months. Individuals who have had some policy experience in the past and who obviously do not have a common view on everything, but we feel a common belief, we have a common belief in the power and efficacy of diplomacy and dialogue. And we initiated what we call the Amity Circle to help propel and push the notion of diplomacy as the preferred path in dealing with the problems of our time. Today, Ong Keng Yong and dear friends and colleagues, I'm not to deep dive or to speak in detail about specific conflict situations, but simply to identify and to recognize a central challenge which I feel that we all face. Namely, how can we alter the dynamics? How can we alter a vicious circle to a virtuous one? How can one disrupt a negative situation of more tensions and more mistrust to one of developing of strategic trust? Essentially, to disrupt what would otherwise be a constant vicious cycle towards more higher potential for conflict. I do sincerely believe that in the absence of a concerted and deliberate attempt to change and to alter the dynamics, then we will be facing more of the same. Less security and greater potential for open conflict. For instance, when we speak of geopolitical divide, that is obviously very real and very common and not likely to go away, because we can't simply wish this competition and divide away. How can we, notwithstanding such a reality, allow diplomacy, allow dialogue to promote the notion of strategic stability? That while competition may be inevitable, it doesn't have to lead to open conflict. Here, I think there is a role for diplomacy to play. For instance, how to decipher intent, the intent of the other side. Nowadays, in the absence of meaningful capacity to employ or deploy words, countries convey their intentions through the mobilization of military assets and other conduct, which actually leads to greater instability. How can we, through diplomacy, promote predictability of behavior, certain code of conduct? Many years ago now, we proposed such an idea for the South China Sea, the famous code of conduct that's still being negotiated today. A code of conduct for the wider region, how to behave amidst the conflict and the competition, is something that diplomacy can help promote. When we talk about the weaponization of global commons, how geopolitical tensions and divide affects cooperation on issues such as climate, public health, AI, and other global common issues. How can we create, through diplomacy, safe space so that we draw a line that these are domains, these are areas that would benefit more from cooperative partnership rather than from competition and division. Managing actual and potential conflicts. How can we promote peaceful settlement of disputes? How can we promote crisis management so that to avoid a minor incident from cascading to become a more serious situation? How can we promote multilateralism fit for purpose? In other words, I feel that in many of those challenges or manifestation of fragmentation that each and every one of us can sketch, I feel that there is a role for diplomacy and for dialogue to help and be part of the solution. In the Amity circle that I speak about earlier, we have tried to have a discussion amongst us that not only simply describe the problems, but we try to identify the pathways to diplomacy and dialogue, so that we don't simply express concern, we don't simply make a plea for restraint, but try to identify what are the pathways so that we can move from the current situation to the situation or dynamic where we wish to be. It is in this connection, Paung Keng Yong, and this is my final body of thoughts, so to speak, that led me to reflect on what are actually the conditions conducive for diplomacy and dialogue to find traction. Clearly, there is no one-size-fits-all. The situations one encounters in the region, they are unique. Each of them are unique, demanding special approach, potential solutions. That notwithstanding, I feel that there are a number of traits, a number of qualities that are almost generic in nature that would be prerequisites before efforts at diplomacy, efforts at dialogue can find traction. The first that I would want to highlight is simply political will. This is seems like an obvious point, but one that is in short supply, unfortunately, in our present age. The courage and the willingness of leaders, of governments, to exercise leadership, to see beyond what is immediately before them. Political will and political commitment to address the issue through diplomacy and political settlement. This is, I think, one of the key first ingredient to any possibility for diplomacy and traction to find, and diplomacy and dialogue to find traction. Mutual trust, I would also identify as a key ingredient. Not necessarily trust of one another, because often one of the defining features of a dispute is lack of trust, but at least trust in the negotiating process, in the dialogue process itself, that we feel, the parties feel that through diplomacy, through dialogue, we can find a mutually acceptable solution. Trust and confidence in the political process. And often case, this will require not quite the intervention, but the facilitating role of a third party. Because in the absence of trust between the two conflicting parties, then the facilitating role of a third party becomes extremely important. Political will, mutual trust and confidence, at least in the political process, and not least of all, mutual interest in seeing political process find traction. Often case, nowadays when we speak of diplomacy and dialogue, recourse to diplomacy, recourse to dialogue is seen as a sign of weakness, of appeasement, of giving ground, making concessions. This is where I think a perspective or paradigm shifts is necessary. Because nowadays when we have a conflict situation where positions and outlook are very strongly felt, any attempt at finding common grounds can often be immediately attacked as being justifying or being weak in the face of the adversary. This is where I think resilience and the courage to actually press on with a political settlement becomes extremely important. Cooperative partnership, a mindset that sees in diplomacy as a win-win process, is quite disappointing often when you encounter situation when parties, countries engage in diplomacy and negotiation already with the mindset that one side must win, prevail over the other. When in fact one of the hallmark of a good settlement is when both sides or all sides feel that they have ownership in the process and not felt that they have been hard done by the outcome. Cooperative partnership is extremely important quality as well. Internal, external synergy. Cases where efforts at diplomacy, efforts at dialogue requires the support of the internal domestic constituencies. Unfortunately, nowadays, with the advent of social media and the like, and combined with leadership deficit, often any efforts at diplomatic solution, political solution, immediately face the challenge of willingness to go against the current prevailing opinion. And not least of all, capacities. The ability to have the capacity to see, to pursue multi-pronged approach, informal, formal, direct, indirect. Recently, in the conversation that we were having in the Amity circle that I mentioned before, I was informed by one of my colleagues from Indonesia who also take part in this process, just to illustrate the extent to which, if with the requisite political will, we can make the case for diplomacy. When Indonesia was engaged in dialogue or negotiation with the Free Aceh movement, which at the time obviously wanted to secede from Indonesia, but post-tsunami we were engaged in a dialogue, in negotiation in a way, to find a political settlement. One of the first concern expressed by the other side, meaning by the separatist movement, is that they are not willing to enter into a diplomatic phase or dialogue phase because they have no capacities, because they've been used to basically taking up arms. And they feel that if they were to be engaged in a dialogue or in a negotiation, they will be at a disadvantage. Quite remarkably, I think, the Indonesian government actually said, look, what do you need? And direct them to third parties in the United States, actually, who help them to empower their delegation, to strengthen their capacities, so that we can achieve a good agreement, an agreement that they feel they are comfortable with as well. Now, this type of willingness to look at the bigger picture and not to prevail unilaterally, one side winning over the other, is a quality that I think is often missing nowadays. The point, I mentioned those conditions, Pa Ong Keng Yong, in a very almost haphazard way, conditions conducive for diplomacy to find traction, political will, political commitment, mutual trust, confidence in the political process, cooperative partnership, internal, external synergy, capacities. I mentioned them, and I'm sure each and every one of you can add more to the list. But what I find most encouraging, and this is my final point, is that those qualities have been in existence in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia. How else can we in Southeast Asia otherwise refer to so many conflict situations that we have either resolved fully or at least managed and not allowed to worsen? Simply to read out a few by way of institutional or by way of regional experience. The Jakarta informal meetings on the conflict in Cambodia, which Indonesia helped with ASEAN facilitate and led to the comprehensive Cambodian peace agreement in 1991. The informal South China Sea workshop series that eventually led to the ASEAN-China process on the South China Sea. The bilateral agreements between Indonesia and Malaysia, Malaysia and Singapore to bring their own respective cases to the ICJ. An act of great statesmanship on the part of the leaders of the countries concerned to bring these cases that defy solutions on their own between them, but not wishing to leave the issue to the future generations, to take it to the ICJ. The Philippines' engagement especially of Malaysia and Indonesia in dealing with the situation in the southern Philippines that led to the agreement with the Moro National Liberation Front and then the MILF as well. Indonesia's efforts to ensure that there are some of our ASEAN neighbors involved in our management of the Aceh situation, to help observe the agreement that we reached with the Free Aceh movement. We were persistent in asking Thailand to take part, Malaysia, the Philippines, to help observe the peace agreement. Also, Indonesia's efforts to appeal and insist on our ASEAN neighbors to be part of the UN operations in East Timor, when East Timor chose to secede, to separate from Indonesia. Cambodia and Thailand disputes in 2011 that ASEAN helped to manage, and not least of all on Myanmar until the recent episodes. The point being, dear friends and colleagues, is that Southeast Asia, and I choose to use the term Southeast Asia and not necessarily ASEAN, has a rich experience of managing conflict situations, in placing diplomacy and dialogue at the forefront. So there must be some conditions conducive that we possess, that we have been able in the past to tap and to utilize. And I think today, as we confront the situation in the South China Sea, we confront the situation in Myanmar, it's important for us not to be too underwhelming in our response, because we have had a good body of experience to be able to guide us in dealing with such situations. But the purpose of my little remarks today, Paung Keng Yong, is not necessarily to provide answer, but to simply recall that in most instances, in all instances, ultimately, conflict situations must be managed, must be resolved through political settlement, through diplomacy even. So, that being the case, wouldn't it be far better if we front load efforts of this type rather than wait until all parties, the conflicting parties, have mutually destroyed one another, cause massive humanitarian casualties and physical destructions. And I think our part of the world, Southeast Asia, have a lot actually to impart elsewhere, but the business starts at home first. We have two litmus tests, the South China Sea and Myanmar, which we must try to address. Terima kasih, Pak Ong Keng. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Papa. I think it is a very useful summary of the challenges we face and what are the kind of tools we can resort to or ways in which we can find among ourselves our own experiences to handle all these difficult questions and situations on the ground. Right now, I want to welcome all your comments or questions. Yeah, don't give him an easy time. Yeah, let's throw him all the difficult comments or question you have. I think we will do 2 or 3 in one go. Yeah. So any one of you like to start the ball rolling? Okay, yes. Let's have a first question going.
Thank you. My question is, what impediments do you believe exist that are preventing better relationships between Indonesians and Malaysians? In other words, right now, if you're looking for an investor, both Indonesia and Malaysia will go to Singapore or to Temasek first. But in fact, Gojek is better than Grab. There are a lot of investors who are actually looking to Indonesia as a superior alternative to the smaller population of Singapore. But as of today, Singapore is top dog for both of these two countries. What do you think is necessary for perhaps a return to a Nusantara type alliance?
Before I forget, I think let us know a bit about your background. Introduce yourself, and if you can give us your affiliation before we dissect all your remarks and your questions.
Maaf, saya Matthew Rafat dari Lononot. Terima kasih.
You want to go? Yeah. Okay, maybe we ask another question related. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Pascal Venesson. I'm a senior fellow at RSIS. Many thanks for the talk, and much appreciated. My question is the following. Over the years, many think tanks among ASEAN countries have been cooperating with one another and also engaging with dialogues with practitioners, including diplomats in the so-called 1.5, track 2 diplomacy, these kinds of things. I was wondering if you could share with us your thoughts on whether or not these kinds of initiative would be consistent with some of the points and some of the ideas that you have to reach greater cooperation, greater role for diplomacy. Thank you so much.
Okay, Bob.
Yes.
Over to you.
Well, yes, before I forget the questions. Well, our colleague, thank you very much. I don't quite subscribe to the impression that essentially that there is something that's broken in Indonesia-Malaysia relations. Actually, arguably, within ASEAN, there are a number of bilaterals that underpin ASEAN cooperation. Indonesia-Malaysia, Malaysia-Singapore, Indonesia-Singapore, I think those are at least three countries that's, whose positive relationship really underscore or provide structure to ASEAN's cooperation. And in any case, I think our economies, through the ASEAN Economic Community efforts, there's been a concerted effort to ensure that there is complementarity, there is a win-win approach. So I don't think any one of us are looking at these things in a zero-sum type of outlook. What if I may just simply slightly adjust my response as well. What is interesting though is the fact that with the geopolitical competition that I mentioned before, one of the repercussions of this competition has been the potential for a more fragmented global supply chain, where because of geopolitical drivers, we are all affected by it, and I think countries of Southeast Asia, ASEAN in particular, we have to, in developing our respective economies, we have to be mindful as well how to develop resilience against geopolitical shocks, so that come what may, whatever occurs elsewhere, we within our own region have the sufficient wherewithal to absorb and to deal with this type of geopolitical shocks, rather than a very mercantilist, beggar thy neighbor type of approach where one's prosperity is at the expense of the other. I think ASEAN countries, Indonesia, Malaysia included, have been able to develop a very win-win type of approach. Our colleague's question, the second one, yes, I think there is within ASEAN's main outlook has always been inclusive, whether it be on track 1, the idea of ASEAN developing its dialogue partner relationships with key countries of the region, and as well as in track 1.5 as well, track 2 even. So I think in all these ASEAN's efforts, or Indonesia at the very least as well, that we've always been trying to promote inclusive type of processes in our region, both track 1 as well as track 2 as well. And we see the evidence of it in not only in the ASEAN Regional Forum, but all the various think tanks, process that think tanks in our region help promote. What is interesting though, the point that I was trying to hint to earlier, is that increasingly the notion of ASEAN centrality is being, not quite challenged, but it has to be re-earned. We have to earn once again ASEAN centrality, meaning ASEAN's relevance in the face of the current geopolitical push and pull and challenges, to be sure that we have responses that are relevant to the challenges. That's why I think a very clear identification of the problems that we have becomes very, very critical. Otherwise, it will be a solution looking for a problem rather than actually demand-driven efforts. Yeah.
Thank you. As you prepare for the, okay, I don't have to give you all time. Microphone.
Thank you. I'm Richard Borsak. I'm a journalist and adjunct senior fellow at RSIS. I'll be brief. Myanmar, can anybody do anything about it and stop the suffering? ASEAN tried. And back to your previous writing about does ASEAN matter, doesn't look today like ASEAN could do anything. Can anybody do anything?
Okay, over here. Stop. Mr. Wolfgang.
Thank you. Wolfgang Sachsenröder, veteran political scientist. I would like to know how you see the role of the intellectual community, academia, think tank industry. I have been appalled by this theory called Thucydides trap, that a war between the US and China would be as inevitable as the wars between Sparta and Athens more than 2,000 years ago. What is the moral obligation of this intellectual community to influence also the political level?
Well, on Myanmar, we have in this room Dr. Nolin Heiser, who will be far more informed than I could possibly be to try to sketch the type of challenges that we face. But from my perspective, the situation in Myanmar, whether ASEAN would like to admit it or not, is a litmus test for its relevance. I know that we have increasingly been hearing the reality, and it is a reality, that ultimately the situation can only be fully resolved by the people of Myanmar themselves. That there has to be a sense of national ownership, and it must be at the very least Myanmar driven. What I would caution is that this type of very, in my view, correct perspective, that this is ultimately a problem for people of Myanmar to resolve, that does not lead to some kind of a justification for a lesser role for the region in trying to create climate conducive for such a situation to occur. Because ultimately, situations such as Myanmar or other conflict situations in other parts of the world must require a synergy of conditions at the local, national, regional, and global level. And I think Myanmar seems to me fits the description of a situation that are all of the above. It is a local situation in many instances, a national as well in its nature, complexity, as well as regional and global. Now, ASEAN have been quite encouraging at the beginning in coming up with the 5-point consensus, but I do get the impression that I have, and I have the benefit of ignorance because I'm looking from outside within. I do get a sense of a sense of drift in ASEAN's management of collective management of the issue. What I mentioned before in that list of issues previously managed by Southeast Asia, we have had in the past capacity to adopt a very multi-pronged approach, formal, informal, open, and low-key, and all the various toolbox was used by countries of Southeast Asia in dealing with problems of our region. But I feel nowadays on Myanmar we become very, perhaps this is the consequence of a more rules-based ASEAN that's very formal and very, in a way, almost rigid. And we are missing the type of agility that we perhaps possessed in the past that would have allowed us to navigate the intricate situations that we did before. That is not possible today. But having said that, clearly the environment within which any diplomatic efforts is taking place today is far different to in the past. I remember Dr. Nolin has spoken in the past about the impact of social media, the impact, etc., of any efforts at peace and dialogue immediately have to deal with such a difficult terrain. But I do feel that having now, 3 years and a bit, it is important for the leaders of ASEAN to take stock once again on how they're doing on this Myanmar portfolio. Otherwise, it's like an open wound. And I hope we are not going to this revisionist idea that this is not the type of conflict situation that ASEAN should get into because it's an internal conflict, etc. Given the fact that in the past we have been able to do precisely deal with this situation similar to this as well.
Thank you, but my own view is that in the case of Myanmar, it's not just ASEAN member states trying to find a way forward. The two most important guys that we have somewhat got them off the hook really is 1, India, and 2, China. So the left door and the roof. Yeah, we are only on the right door, yeah, or the right wall. Yeah, so a house have to be at least 2 different wall foundation, and it is important not to be distracted by the idea that we have tried and it is not working. Yeah. Basically, the 5-point consensus is the only thing on the table that we have in concrete terms. But going forward, the 2 most important neighboring countries of Myanmar, namely China and India, must play their part too. Yeah. The worst thing about these 2 guys is that at least the Western boys are saying, you are ASEAN centrality, you take care of yourself. These 2 big guys don't say anything. Yeah. And just make sure that, there is no bloody situation on their respective border. But at the rate they are going, there will be a lot of bloody situation on the border, on the Indian side as well as now on the Chinese border with Myanmar.
What is encouraging at the very least now, compared to regions elsewhere or even Myanmar issue in the past, is that there is one consensus almost from within the international community that this is an issue for ASEAN to manage. And it makes it even more incumbent on ASEAN to actually deliver on this expectation. And fortunately as well, thanks to ASEAN's relative cohesion up till now, we have been able to sort of manage the potential geopolitical push and pull replicated or imposed on Myanmar already complex national conditions. You know, you look at situations, for instance, like in Syria, when it was at one time imploding, it was on top of the national situations. You have the push and pull from the different geopolitical rivals. In the case of Myanmar, thus far, notwithstanding the reality that Paung Keng Yong described about India and China also needing to play its role, we've been able to manage that. That's why I think it's very important for us to come up with a script. This is how we wish India to align, how we wish China to align, because otherwise it will become like a anything goes type of thing. India will look at whatever China proposed in Myanmar as with a degree of suspicion, and likewise from the other side. Again, ASEAN provides like a safe house, like a safe space for negotiations to take place. But yeah.
Yeah, I think in short, the Myanmar situation will have to be decided by the Myanmar people themselves. Yeah, but right now, I don't think there's anyone inside Myanmar can be a decisive player to make a particular situation to be the defining moments of the future of the country.
But meanwhile, at the same time, the regional ramifications are being felt, increasingly being felt. Border with Thailand, outflow of refugees, the whole perception of the world about Southeast Asia. So it is a national issue, but one that ASEAN cannot completely absolve itself from, I guess. Yeah, because,
sure, yeah.
Because it's in our neighborhood. Yeah.
Yeah, but I wish ASEAN centrality can also allow us to point our finger at the two big neighbors and maybe even those guys who are happily sitting somewhere else. The reality is that the situation in Myanmar is very serious. Yeah. Recently, I traveled with my colleagues from RSIS to China, not to the capital city, not to the Shanghai or the commercial city, but to the 2 or 3 big provinces facing Myanmar. I think they are all expert over there, watching the situation closely, but they are bewildered by the possibility that their respective countries, their respective leaders have to get in, because everybody knows that this is a real, what's the word, quicksand. You can never come out unless you go into the quicksand wearing steel cables so that at the right moment you give out a scream, they'll switch on the machine to wind back the steel cable so that you don't get drowned into the quicksand. Yeah, but for whatever it's worth, having worked on ASEAN matters over the past many years, I think the situation requires both Southeast Asian nations as well as the 2 most important neighbors of Myanmar to come together and work out something. Yeah. Right now, both waiting for the other guy, praying that some miracle will happen on the ASEAN side, and ASEAN side praying that some miracle will happen on the Indian side or the Chinese border side. Well, as somebody said in Europe, we let you all Asians sort it out lah. There may be fewer Asian, it's okay. There are too many Asian anyway. Yeah. So that kind of cynical attitude is no good. Yeah. But more importantly, I think the fact is there are people suffering and crossing the border into different other parts of what they have, different other parts of the territory they are familiar with. So it's important for the leadership in ASEAN as well as those neighboring countries to find a way to go forward. Yeah. The danger, Marty, is the famous lady is not healthy and go on forever, no? What happened with the passing of Aung San Suu Kyi? Free for all. Then it might be even more terrible situation. But then now nobody knows where she is. Is there anybody who knows where she is exactly, in a bungalow somewhere in the Myanmar city or of whatever name they have speculated? But I think this is something that ASEAN leaders will be running out of time soon. Whether something can actually happen in the coming months, we're not sure. The problem in ASEAN is that we are changing our chairman country every year. So some countries are happy to pretend that nothing happened. Yeah, what the three monkeys, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. Then occasionally you have Papa Indonesia who want to do something, but nowadays Papa Indonesia also very reluctant to push his weight around. I think we need to push a bit. Yeah. Sorry to say that. If Singapore push a bit, we will maybe step on the toes of Papa Indonesia, you know, or even Papa Malaysia. Yeah. So we are the children. We are the child stage. We just stay in the playhouse, in the kindergarten, hoping that some bigger adults can come and do something. Yeah. Anyway, that's the dilemma that ASEAN has to face. I personally feel sorry to see all my friends and contacts whom I have met over the years in Myanmar, either lying low in Myanmar somewhere, or can't even go home to their respective village or cities they are born in. So the rest of the world, I think, will just leave it to us. So us means what? India, China, and ASEAN. Yeah. Okay. I think we have started to have a conversation between Papa, Marty, and myself. No good. Let's go back to you. Any other questions? Comments? Okay.
Excuse me. My name is Deepen. I'm with RSIS. It's a pleasure to listen to you, Dr. Natalegawa, and particularly for striking a hopeful stance in these rather troubled times. I'd like to turn to ASEAN. There was some, both you and Ambassador Ong shared some disquieting comments on the state of progress towards any particular initiatives. If you look at the early years, as you pointed out in the earlier talks, one thing that's held ASEAN together over the years is the realization that the whole is considerably greater than the sum of the parts. And that's being severely challenged today for the lack of consensus. Yet for any forward movement, the initiative has to come from within. And the question I wanted to pose to you is, there are a number of issues which are relatively non-controversial in the international domain, but directly germane to our existence and progress. And amongst them, it could be the marine economy, for instance, which accounts for more than a third of our GDP. Just yesterday, there was a report that we in this region are ingesting more plastic on a daily basis than any other part of the world. On other issues such as digitization across the region and trade, which could substantially bring down costs and make ASEAN as attractive as it has been prior to the current logjam in geopolitics in the past as a destination for supply chain. For food security, which reveal new threats that we'd never encountered or thought of before. Given the inability to forge a consensus across the 10 members, and the few tend to be intransigent on most issues, do you see a possibility for the original ASEAN 5 plus Vietnam to move ahead and try to forge a consensus? And in the absence of a regional dialogue, what could possibly propel such conversations? The realization that there are substantial benefits without stepping on anybody else's toe should be there, yet we don't seem to be able to break out of this morass. And thank you.
Well,
Well, thank you very much. You have identified a number of areas: marine economy, digitalization, food security, which reminds that the domain or the area for ASEAN cooperation or the opportunities present before it is actually quite an extensive one, far beyond merely the type of issues that I have mentioned before, the geopolitical push and pull, etc. But one thought that I'd like to impart is that this cooperation on these issues, they are not merely functional in nature, because they have also been affected by political push and pull. We can't really nowadays assume that these are domains that are immune and unaffected by the overarching geopolitical push and pull. This is the weaponization of cooperation across the board, the widening of geopolitical instincts and competition. But if we assume that somehow we can isolate these domains from the overall geopolitical push and pull that I mentioned, then we see the reality, the potential that the level of the engagement and the level of interest from ASEAN member economies on these issues vary. We can't expect all of them to have the same degree of interest, the same degree of concern, and even readiness in many cases to deal with these issues as a perfect collective 10. And I think in many instances, certainly in the economic domain, there are possibilities for ASEAN cooperation to pursue a two-track approach where you allow cooperation between certain ASEAN economies to take place before others who are then ready to join in the efforts, they can join and coalesce with those possibilities. And I think this is one of ASEAN's strengths in the past, being able to, on the one hand, recognize that these are issues that eventually will need to encompass all the ASEAN 10, but in getting there, we need to allow for incremental, step-by-step development. Otherwise, we have a situation where sense of comfort level that individual ASEAN member states on these issues may not be in existence just yet. But the case that I was trying to make earlier is that even on this sort of functional cooperation issues, they are also affected by the geopolitical push and pull. And as a result, therefore, investing in managing geopolitical competition is actually quite necessary still, because we cannot contain their impact as well.
So I know you cannot say anything since your new president has not come to office yet, but given your knowledge of his character and personality, will he be pushing all the other ASEAN guys to come out with something more concrete?
Well, first of all, I'm not privy to his, I haven't sufficient information and knowledge of what the incoming president's inclinations and outlooks are. But from what we have been seeing as a defense minister and now even as president-elect, seemingly, to me, we will have a president who will be far more comfortable in dealing with foreign policy issues, engaging internationally and globally. And this is already a very important asset to foresee a more engaged Indonesia in the region and beyond. And we've seen it even the past few weeks, how defense minister / president-elect has expressed his views and ideas on many global issues. So I think, in my view, the next 5 years we'll probably see a more regular type of Indonesia, regular in the sense of returning to the conventional situation of an Indonesia that is very much engaged with the region and engaged globally as well. But those are just the views of some totally ignorant person from outside, yeah.
Well, at the Shangri-La dialogue the other day, in reaction to his proposal to send peacekeeper to Gaza, somebody next to me said, how about sending Indonesian peacekeeper to Myanmar? So I look at him, I say, okay, do you want to take a bet or I'm just making frivolous comments? And he wanted to bet with me. I said, no, I'm not a gambling man, so yeah. But let's just wait and see. Anything else related to Myanmar before we move on? Yeah. Anyone have something else to add to the Myanmar situation? I know we're Nolin Hazel here, but I am not going to pressure her to say anything because we should hear some more views from the others. If not, then any other questions or comment? Okay, yeah.
Thank you. Han Fuk Kwang from RSIS. Thank you, Dr. Marty, for your talk. I suppose it's it's easy to agree with your thesis, that you need more diplomacy and dialogue to have the outcome that you would want in this fragmented world. But the reality is that it's not happening to the extent that we all desire, right? So is leadership, my question is leadership a problem? Leadership that matters, whether in regional organizations like ASEAN or in the individual countries. After all, somebody needs to initiate the diplomacy or the dialogue to frame the issues in a way which will lend them to resolution and to bring the contending parties together. If indeed there is a deficit of leadership in today's world, what needs to be done to overcome this particular problem?
Well, absolutely. I think, in the face of the obvious, namely the challenging situation that we are facing, the fragmentation that we are experiencing and witnessing, the lack of response in terms of preference for engaging through diplomacy and dialogue, there is a need for disruptive, positive disruptive element here. Because at the moment, we are just almost business as usual. The wonderful thing about people, the responsibility is on the shoulders of those who are in a position to effect positive change, to seize and to address this. Otherwise, that's why I put in the list of conditions conducive that I thought is important, is that political will and commitment. It's extremely easy to identify and to reason why we cannot do things. This is not our responsibility, it's some others. But leaders lead. ASEAN in the past, Southeast Asia, have not been shy in actually pressing and confronting these issues head on. And for each of those episodes, there are always people who will detract. When Indonesia first initiated the idea of South China Sea workshop that eventually led to the South China Sea ASEAN-China process, many in the region thought we were being busybody because they felt post-Cambodia conflict, we were just looking for some other new project to promote. But we were 10, 15, 20 years early in anticipation of what was to come. And that type of foresight and courage to identify emerging need is something that is, I feel, somewhat missing. When in 2003, Indonesia as chair of ASEAN began the process, initiated the idea of an ASEAN community with 3 pillars to add to the economic pillar that Singapore already introduced. Again, we were almost at the point of being ridiculed. What are you talking about? ASEAN political security community? We are non-interference, sovereign. But we were saying we are imagining a world not of 2003, but the world of 2023, 20 years from now. And this is where I feel there is this deficit at the moment, ability to address the reality that issues such as the South China Sea, such as Myanmar, actually is debilitating ASEAN. It is positively negative in its impact to ASEAN. We can't opt out, much as the way we can't opt out of geopolitical competition. But it's always a struggle between those who are looking at glass half empty and half full. But I'm on the side of those. My motto is always this, like we wage peace aggressively, as aggressively as nations prepare for war. But we seize the momentum, which I feel sometimes is a little bit in a downturn at the moment. Yeah.
You know, talking about diplomacy and dialogue, you mentioned about these Amity circles. Can you elaborate a bit more whether this can be used to help in our ASEAN problem? For example, Myanmar. Is there a circle already out there? Or many circles already?
Yes, well, it is a very modest and humble effort. First of all, I felt that there are constituencies out there, colleagues out there in ASEAN, in Southeast Asia, who have had policy experience in the past, who dealt on a day-to-day basis with issues of the region and learn the hard way what works and what doesn't. And I feel that there is a reservoir of not only expertise, but a reservoir of interests out there that have not been fully tapped and fully recognized. And informal conversation with some of my former colleagues, not only in ASEAN, I hasten to add, also from Australia, from New Zealand, from Japan and Korea, I find that there was a resonance that while we all have our own respective activities now and don't necessarily have a common view, that we feel that each and every one of us feel that diplomacy and dialogue should be more consistently promoted. And there was a feeling as well that some of the informal approaches that ASEAN have been very good at in the past is beginning to be a little bit less than it was before. So our group, about 12, 13 person, we've met twice over the past 6 months in a very much like a retreat format with no presumption of anything other than to be able to converse amongst ourselves and identify challenges of the type that not this unlike what I have sketched out earlier, but more importantly, I think, not simply to lament or to express concern, but to try to identify pathways towards diplomacy and dialogue. And what we do is that post-event, post-gathering, we then channel our discussions to our respective stakeholders to compare notes and to share some perspectives. So it's meant to be a very incremental, step-by-step process where eventually we will have more and more, hopefully, people, colleagues into the circle to have this conversation, which has been actually to me, it's been terrific because I've been able to get in touch again with our former colleagues and discuss issues of mutual interest and concern.
Okay, so at the moment is very private level individuals
Absolutely.
coming together to find a the magic wand that you're looking for. Hey, I got this, Joel, Dr. Joel, question?
Hi, Dr. Marty, it's good to hear you again. My question is, there in certain negotiations, you have things that are considered non-negotiable, and states will have often concerns that are so-called red lines or out of bounds for discussion. But lately, often it was couched in terms of sovereign interests, and that's fair. But lately, we have them in terms of national security interests. And national security is one of those terms where it can either be very big or very small, depending on how you define it. And lately, it seems to be growing every day. So how do you kind of push back on things, especially where these issues might have regionally destabilizing consequences if they're not discussed?
Well, I think in making the suggestion for the pursuit of diplomacy and dialogue, I'm not pretending that the issues before us are all necessarily ripe for solution. Most of the issues that are before us in this part of the world, they are of long-standing nature, decades long. So at the very minimum, the pursuit of diplomacy and dialogue should be without prejudice to one's prejudice to one's national position. At the very least, an agreement to manage and not make the situation worse. Pending, one day perhaps we will have the wisdom to actually resolve the issues, to settle the disputes. But at the moment, I feel that even that agreement to not make things better, to manage, are unraveling. Because a lot of these issues that are now suddenly flaring up, they're not new issues. They're actually issues that have been simmering, but in the past we've been able to put a lid on them. But now there is an action-reaction, and that is why when Indonesia initially proposed the idea of the Code of Conduct for the South China Sea or the South China Sea process itself, it was always premised on the assumption that this is without prejudice to one's national position. So the fact that the issues are intractable, difficult, those are facts of life, those are real, and there are a lot of emotions behind them, but they don't actually have to lead to open conflict. There are ways and means to resolve them. At one time, as a young diplomat, when I was far too idealistic, when we discussed the ASEAN political security community, I suggested the idea, we should have a list of compendium of all the disputes in Southeast Asia. We have a list so that we are ready. Early detection, early warning. But then I quickly realized as a young diplomat that even to have that list is already a recognition by one or the other side that there is a dispute before them. So then clearly that is not possible. But then at least the idea of management of the conflict, I think, is very, very important. For the South China Sea, for instance, if there was twin agreement, twin principle, one, the notion of peaceful settlement, not only exercise of restraint, but non-use of force, and also an agreement that whatever you do on the ground, whatever new facts that you are trying to establish at sea or on the ground will not affect the strength or otherwise of your claim, that there is no acquiescence being suggested by the other side, then whatever you do between the date of whatever we agree on wouldn't be interpreted as being acquiescence by one side or demonstration of sovereign rights or sovereign exercise of sovereign jurisdiction by the other. I remember in the case of Sipadan Ligitan, when Indonesia and Malaysia had that dispute over the two islands and the matter was brought to the ICJ, the evidence of state practice that the ICJ turned to wasn't Malaysia's or Indonesia's various activities or non-activities, but it was the Dutch East Indies and the British when originally with the notion of the dispute first arose. So whatever else that had taken place since, all the activities, counter activities, wasn't really considered by the ICJ because they felt it was already not genuine exercise of state practice. I'm obviously oversimplifying, but the point being, I think diplomacy and dialogue does not presume that these are issues necessarily ripe for solution, and it doesn't pretend that they are not without a lot of national emotion involved. But we can agree to disagree, and we can agree to manage these issues. And what is at stake for Southeast Asia, for the Asia Pacific, is the peace dividend we have been enjoying. I mean, our region have prospered because we've had peace and stability. And it would be we are on the cusp of seeing the world's gravitate towards our region as a locomotive, the world global economy, etc. The greatest folly for us is that if on the eve of such a situation, we somehow manage to self-destruct. And this is where I think if we don't have the wisdom to solve the problems now, at least we agree to do no harm, not to add to those problems.
Yeah, put the lid on so that it doesn't blow up. Yeah. That is Joel Ng from RSIS. He wrote a book about African Union and ASEAN. Yes. Yeah. So a copy is here for you. Afterward, I will present to you. Yeah. Yeah. So, I have to take care of all my young colleagues who write books and nobody buy them. Okay, any more? Comments or questions? Yeah.
This one.
Okay, yes.
Thank you, Park, for your insights. My name's Kevin. I'm from RSIS as well. My question, I'd just like to pick up on a thread that you mentioned just now about ASEAN needing to wage peace aggressively and to be forward-thinking. There are a lot of minilateral structures that have been, entered this region recently, and they've introduced their own views of how this region should be. In light of this, do you think ASEAN should stick to what it laid out in the outlook for the Indo-Pacific a few years ago, or should it consider the document kind of a living document and continually update it every few years or so? Thank you.
Yes. Well, a document of that type, a vision of that type, clearly would not be cast in stone, but it has to evolve and adapt and adjust as circumstances develop and arises. But the multilaterals that you mentioned, that I think I also identified earlier, to me is a reflection of an unfelt, unmet needs in our region. ASEAN has never pretended to be exclusive in the sense that there's only the ASEAN way and there's no other processes, because we have been able to coexist with other multilateral processes throughout ASEAN's existence. But what makes the current dynamic rather unique is that the more recent multilaterals, in its impression that I have, tend to be like almost circumventing ASEAN, and in a way a product of ASEAN's deficiencies. For instance, the trilateral US, Japan, and the Philippines on the South China Sea. Would that have been necessary if the ASEAN-China process have taken a far better, make further better progress than it did, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it is important for ASEAN not to be complacent and to constantly nurture, develop, and invest in the various modalities it already has before it. And the Indo-Pacific vision that ASEAN has adopted is an important starting point, but it is a vision. I think we have quite a vision in ASEAN. Sometimes it's double vision, but anyway.
We are very visionary. Yeah, Anyway, I always say when you talk about vision, it's a V sign, right? So peace lah. So anyway, you happy with that answer? Oh, okay. Wow. Anybody else? Any comments or questions? Okay. This young lady have a comment to make. Yeah.
So I'm Nolene Hazer. I'm not going to talk about Myanmar, but Marty, thank you very much for that wonderful talk, and Ambassador Ong for moderating this very interesting panel. But I wanted to just say that when you talk about the political back and forth and so on, I think it's not just about leadership. A lot of it is actually rooted in the fact that we actually have a struggle about our normative future. In other words, very different understanding of what the normative frameworks are. And that makes it easier for people to break the rule of law and even the rule of war, because they're moving in an entirely different frame of mind. And they think that they are actually moving with leadership as they understand it. So that makes it extremely difficult to actually encourage dialogue and diplomacy when on very different terms, unless you can find like a common thread. And maybe the common thread is a common humanity at the end of the day. But that's not actually spoken enough. And we have seen the consequences of that and the impunity that comes with that. Nobody seems to have the power to prevent us from going into a worse state. I'm not going to mention what I'm talking, the case I'm thinking of, but frankly, if that is how we are actually moving towards, unless we can find common grounds to deal with, solidarity as self-interest, to deal with many of the common challenges which we face as humanity. And this actually brings us to an entirely different discussion of where to put the dialogue as well as the diplomacy. And of course, we have all our charters and all that, but many people see that as aspirations rather than rooted in real governance. Just
Nothing to add for you?
No, thank you.
Wow, okay. Yeah. I think we have to work on this, on what we talk about diplomacy and dialogue. Some people don't like dialogue. They just want to have diplomacy. But diplomacy without dialogue is not meaningful, right? Okay, let's us think a bit more about that and stay tuned for the next speaker or maybe the next chapter of Marty's Amity circle, yeah. But for now, I think I would like to bring the proceeding to a close. Yeah. Thank you, Papa Marty. Yeah. You want to say something? No. Last 1 minute? No?
Oh, yes, why not?
Yeah, well,
to say thank you.
Okay.
I wanted to thank you, Pa Ong Keng Yong, and to all colleagues who have been so patient, as I had forewarned them. I will be taxing their patience, and thank you for listening and for the questions and comments. I leave the discussions with more questions that I need to develop on, but I hope you can take the basic message that I was trying to convey is that in facing the current situation that we are, we need to place diplomacy at the forefront. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.